For a long time, I believed that if something wasn't working, it meant I wasn't working hard enough. That belief helped me early on. It even became part of my identity. But at some point, without a clear moment, without an obvious failure, hard work stopped being the determining factor. And I didn't see it at the time. I just worked harder. This episode isn't about laziness, and it's not an argument against discipline. It's about a mistake I've made more than once. A moment when effort keeps consuming energy, focus, and time, but stops changing the outcome. What I want to talk about is not quitting early. It's something more uncomfortable than that. It's about misreading what the system is already telling you. Early in my career, effort worked almost flawlessly. If I pushed harder, things improved. If I stayed longer, I learned more. If I said yes, doors opened. The relationship between input and outcome felt clean. Effort in, progress out. So I internalized a simple rule. When things slow down, push harder. At the time, that rule was correct. The problem is that I kept using it long after the environment had changed. Over time, the systems I was working in became more complex. More people, more competition, more noise, more invisible constraints. But my internal model didn't update. I kept treating effort as if it were still the main variable, as if working harder would eventually overpower resistance. What I didn't see was that effort had stopped being the deciding input. It was still necessary, but it was no longer decisive. Looking back, the real mistake wasn't working hard. It was that I never stopped to reconsider how likely success still was. I kept assuming that the probability hadn't changed, that the project, the direction, the idea was still fundamentally sound if I just stayed disciplined enough. Instead of asking, what is the system responding to? I kept asking, how can I push this further? That felt responsible. It felt professional. It was also avoidance. Much later, I encountered a way of thinking that explained this pattern cleanly. It comes from statistics, but you don't need the math. The idea is simple. You start with a belief about how likely something is to succeed. You take action. You observe the response. And then, this is the part I used to skip, you update your belief. Not emotionally, not defensively, probabilistically. You don't ask, did I try hard enough? You ask, given this response, how likely is success now? At the time, I wasn't doing that. I was treating effort as evidence. This is difficult because effort feels moral. Working hard feels like commitment, like seriousness, like character. Early resistance feels like something to overcome, not something to interpret. But resistance isn't always a challenge. Sometimes it's information. Low engagement, slow traction, repeated friction. These aren't judgments, they're signals, and ignoring them doesn't make you resilient. It just delays clarity. I've seen this pattern repeat in many forms. A new project launches. The thinking is solid, the execution is competent, but the response is muted. People don't return. Momentum doesn't build naturally. Every gain feels forced. At that point, two paths appear. One is familiar. Work longer, refine more, push harder. The other is quieter. Step back and ask what the response actually means. The first path feels active. The second feels like hesitation. But only one updates reality. I stayed on the first path longer than I should have more than once. This pattern isn't personal. A historical example that clarified this for me is Eastman Kodak Company. Kodak wasn't blind. They weren't lazy. They weren't stupid. They invented the digital camera. They saw the signal early. But the early data was inconvenient, low quality, low margins, slow adoption. So they treated it as immature, something to revisit later. Instead, they doubled down on what still worked: film, chemistry, optimization. All reasonable decisions based on assumptions that hadn't been updated. By the time the signal became undeniable, the effort invested in the old system had become a constraint. That example stayed with me because I recognized the pattern. There's a point where effort turns into weight. You think, I've already invested too much to stop, but past effort doesn't increase future success. It only increases attachment. At that stage, working harder doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like obligation. That's often the moment when hard work truly stops working. Not because you're wrong to care, but because the decision should have changed earlier.
I don't think effort is overrated. I think it's often mistimed. Effort works when response improves with iteration, resistance decreases over time, momentum builds naturally. Effort fails when every gain feels forced. Feedback stays flat. Progress depends entirely on willpower. Now, I try to treat effort as something that follows signal, not something that creates it. That shift changed how I work, and, more importantly, when I stop. Hard work doesn't stop working randomly. It stops working when it's applied after the system has already answered. The skill isn't endurance. It's knowing when effort compounds and when it only delays the right decision. That's not quitting. That's learning to update your understanding of reality before effort becomes the thing holding you in place.